Former Vice President Joe Biden apologized over the weekend after weeks of criticism for his remarks about working with segregationist senators in the 1970s. At a campaign event in South Carolina, Biden said that he was sorry for any, quote, pain or misconception he caused when he reminisced about working with segregationists. He also says his record doesn't line up with his comments.
Now, was I wrong a few weeks ago to somehow give the impression to people that I was praising those men who I successfully opposed time and again? Well, yes, I was. I regret it. And I'm sorry for any of the pain or misconception they may have caused anybody.
And joining me now with more on the 2020 race is Washington Post national political correspondent Dave Weigel and Democratic strategist Hari Sevugan. Hari, let's start with you. Do you think that this apology is likely to satisfy Biden's critics?
Probably not. It's probably well overdue. The vice president could have done this weeks ago and defanged these attacks a little more. I think what's happened in waiting so long is he's allowed this to go on and perpetuate itself.
And Dave, another moment that really earned Biden criticism was that moment in the debate when we saw Senator Kamala Harris criticize Biden for opposing federally mandated school desegregation busing when he was in the Senate. But then, since then, Senator Harris herself has now clarified positions on busing. What is her position now?
Her position is basically identical to Biden's now. Her point is that during the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement really continued into the 1970s, Biden was trying to deflect some of the anger at busing away from Democrats by trying to ban the federal imposition of it. And so their argument is that look at how they behaved at the time. The irony of this entire debate, however, is that there are two candidates in this race who have anti-segregation education plans, and these aren't two of them. It's Elizabeth Warren and it's Bernie Sanders who have actually talked about this, have talked about the money they would spend to desegregate schools in the year 2019, 2020. So the debate is, as Hari was saying, it's more about the campaign dynamics here. And it's been a couple of weeks of Joe Biden, who spent 3 years looking like the guy who could have beaten Trump in 2020, looking kind of like a indecisive and shambling candidate. He maybe corrected some of that with this speech, but we're not sure yet.
Hari, I wanted to follow up. Do you feel that this undercuts that moment at all in the debate where Kamala Harris looked so poignantly at him and got emotional? And it was really this poignant moment that we all talked about. Yeah. Do you feel it is still as impactful today as it was then?
Well, I think it has undercut the moment. I mean, the proof is that we're still talking about it, right, in this way. And it plays into what I think is Senator Harris's greatest weakness, which is coming across as calculated, politically calculated. You know, she had T-shirts already made after that debate about "I was that little girl," which is a line from that exchange. And this seems to be part of that vein, and it feeds that narrative. And I think that's the real danger here for her.
Dave, the Washington Post and ABC now are out with a new poll of the Democratic primary race this week. You touched on this. I want to go into more detail. That poll has Biden now leading among Democrats and Democratic leaners. But you highlighted this poll in your newsletter this week. Why did this stand out to you specifically?
Well, it stood out because depending on who you talk to, registered voters, that pool have a greater preference for Biden over Trump than they do for other Democrats versus Trump. Other Democrats, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, among all voters, among the larger pool, all of them do defeat Trump. And the premise of the Biden candidacy is that he, given his experience, given the likability he came into the race with, is in the best position. Really, the entire race, as seen by other campaigns, is whittling that down, making Biden look less electable. But then again, that top line says that of all the candidates running, even after all this, Biden starts with the greatest lead over Trump. And it is hard for the campaigns to make the argument, even though they can look to 2016, they can point to all sorts of polls that change over time. They still are having trouble making the electability argument so long as any poll shows Biden performing better than them.
And this poll also has President Trump at the highest approval rating of his presidency. We are looking at 44%. Hari, I want to ask you, more people still disapprove of his performance, but could this maybe be a concern to Democrats that the tide is shifting?
No, I think there's a ceiling on President Trump's approval. His disapproval is still in the low to mid-50s, and that's been consistent for the 2.5 years of his presidency. I do think, though, that Democrats need to do a better job of framing the economy. And it's not measured by the Dow Jones Industrial Average, or even necessarily unemployment, but by wages, by cost of living, by standard of living. And Democrats need to do a much better job of making that the debate around the economy rather than just what the stock market is doing.
So let's do one more question that I wanted to mention as it pertains to the poll. Is one of the tests President Trump up against a Democratic candidate who you regard as a socialist? So the poll shows him tied among all adults, but leading by 6 among registered voters. What does this tell you about the need for the eventual nominee to attract new voters to the election?
Well, listen, I think the question of whether that candidate is self-identified as a socialist, like Bernie Sanders, let's say, even in head-to-head polls where there's an actual name attached to the socialist candidate, Bernie Sanders, Sanders is still winning. So I think that this question doesn't necessarily get into exactly how voters are thinking about individual candidates, but it does show that Democrats are going to need to grow who's coming out in this election. And that's going to be young voters. That's going to be disproportionately communities that are disproportionately not registered and not turning out. We do need to do a better job of registering those folks and turning them out.
Dave, what would your response be about this, given that Republicans, they have this pattern now of calling even moderate Democrats socialists?
Well, you just pointed out there is a boy who cried wolf problem with this. The Republican Party invested a lot in saying that the Affordable Care Act, which was a compromise that involved markets and healthcare companies, was socialist. They kind of ran out of words to use about Medicare for All, which is a single-payer program like the one used in democratic socialist countries. So this is something Democrats have seen in their focus groups recently. The socialist attack has just been banged up so many times that that sword has been used so many times it's now kind of dull. And they're not being glib about it. They do think that other candidates who are not Bernie Sanders, do not say I'm a socialist, are more electable. They think the attack has been falling flat when it's been used in these House races because Republicans have just over deployed it. It's out of juice.
All right, to you both, Dave Weigel and Hari Sevugan, thank you so much for being here.